What I keep coming back to is the camera. Out of everything that thing could have looked at that night, the house, the corrals, a pen full of cattle standing right beside it, it looked at the camera. I'd strapped that camera to a cedar post on the yard fence, down low, in the dark, in a spot you'd have had to already know was there to ever find it, the lens no bigger than a quarter, faced back toward the house. When I pulled the card the next morning and ran it on the laptop at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, the thing comes up out of the borrow pit, crosses to the fence on two legs, and stops. And it turns its head. And it looks straight into that little lens, and holds there, the way a man turns and looks back at somebody who's been walking behind him too long and has decided to let him know he knows. My name is Wade Griffin. I run cattle in Powder River County, Montana, in the pine breaks west of Broadus, on deeded ground my granddad put together in the 30s, with forest grass leased on the back of it. I've calved in blizzards, pulled dead stock out of bog holes, and shot more coyotes off my calves than I could ever count. There wasn't much left in that country I figured could put a scare in me. I'd have told you that with a straight face, right up until that fall. The cameras were nothing strange. Anybody who runs stock in this kind of country runs cameras now. I had them on the 2 water gaps and the stock tank in the west pasture, because when a float sticks or a line freezes, you want to know before you've got thirsty cows walking a fence down. I had one on the calving shed and one on the gate where the county road comes in. And I had the cell camera, the one that sends a picture to your phone whenever it trips, hung where it could see the lane, because we'd had a fellow come up the road 2 summers back and help himself to a chainsaw and a welder out of the shop, and I wanted a face if he came back. 6 cameras. Then more. I knew that ground through a lens better than most men know their own back 40. They think a thing like that lives off in the timber and you catch a blur of it once and that's the story. It wasn't like that. I had the cameras. I had it on the cameras more nights than I want to remember. And it knew the cameras were there. That's the whole of it, right there. And I'll spend the rest of this trying to make you believe a thing I had a hard enough time believing with the card in my own hand. We run a cow-calf outfit, black baldies mostly, a few straight Angus, 400-some pairs across the deeded and the lease. Connie and I had been married 30-some years by then, and it was the 2 of us and a hired man named Travis who'd been with us going on 3 years. A good hand, young, didn't talk much, which suited me fine. The calves come in the late winter and we brand in the spring, and the whole year bends toward fall, toward shipping, because the calf check is the year. You lose calves, you lose the year. Later, you're going to ask why we didn't just leave, and the answer is that everything we had was standing out in that grass on 4 legs, and you don't walk off and leave it. I should tell you what kind of country it is, so you can put yourself in it. Broke Pine Ridge country, southeast Montana, the Custer timber up to the north of us, and the breaks falling away toward the river on the east, and there's not another set of headlights you'll see most nights. Town is 30 miles off. The nearest neighbor with a light on is Wendell, a few miles north, and past him it's the forest and then nothing for a long stretch. Cell phones don't work out there worth a thing and never have. You get 1 bar by the kitchen window if the wind's right. A man chooses that country or he doesn't last in it, and we'd chosen it our whole lives. And I'd never once in 58 years felt like the dark out there wanted a thing from me. That fall I learned different. A little at a time, an ache a man can ignore right up until the day he can't. It started the 2nd week of September in 2015, and it started so small, I told myself it was nothing for the better part of a month. The horses were first. I keep a couple of saddle horses up close, because you can't gather the brakes in a truck. The country's too broke up, all pine ridge and washout and blind draw, and a man does that work horseback or he doesn't do it. One morning in the middle of September, I went out before light to grain them, and they were standing jammed into the far corner of the corral, both of them, heads up and pointed at the timber off to the north, and they wouldn't come to the grain. A horse will always come to grain. These 2 stood there blowing, that low, rolling snort a horse makes when it's looking at something it doesn't like, and they kept it up until the sky grayed and whatever was in the timber wasn't there anymore. I figured a lion. We've got lions in those breaks. A lion will move a horse like that, and I didn't think much more about it that morning than that. Then, the cattle started bunching. Cows that ought to have been strung out across a half-mile of grass were balled up tight in the open, away from the timber edge, the way they'll do when there's a predator working them. And they were doing it at night. I'd find them in the morning standing in a knot in the middle of the flat with the timber a quarter-mile off on every side, like they'd all agreed in the dark that the trees were not a place to be. And the deer left. That one I noticed on the cameras before I noticed it with my eyes. I'd had mule deer and whitetail on those water cameras every night for years. You run a camera on water in this country and you get deer. All night. Every night. So many you quit looking at them. Sometime in September they quit coming. I'd flip through a card looking for a coyote or a lion, and there'd be nothing on it for nights running. Not a deer, not a rabbit, not a skunk. Empty. A water gap with no deer on it for a week is wrong, the way a town with no dogs barking is wrong. The country had gone empty of everything but my own stock, and my stock was standing out in the open at night, afraid of the trees, even the dog. I had a healer then, a hard little blue dog named Jip who'd bite the heels off a bull and never thought twice about anything in her life. She started sleeping under the porch with her nose pointed north, and she'd growl low at the dark out there. Not barking, just a steady warning sound aimed at the timber, and when I'd go out to see what she was on, there'd be nothing, and she wouldn't go off the porch to check. That was the most of what the dog gave me. I've heard other people's stories lean the whole thing on a dog. Mine didn't. Mine leaned on the cameras and on 400 cows that had decided all at once that the dark wasn't safe. I found the first one on the last day of September. I was checking the tank in the west pasture, and a bunch of magpies came up off the ground over by the timber edge, and I knew before I got there what I'd find. A dead one. You lose stock. It's part of it. And a man learns to read a carcass the way he reads weather. A coyote kill you can read. A lion kill you can read. This one I couldn't. It was a yearling heifer, a good one, 500 pounds, and she was dead at the edge of the trees, and the first thing wrong was that she'd been killed in the open and moved into the timber, and moved is the wrong word, because there was no drag. A lion will cover a kill, scratch dirt and pine duff over it, and it'll feed and come back. A bear will cache it. This heifer had been carried. I could see where she went down in the grass, and I could see where she ended up in under the pines, 20 feet on, and in between there was no furrow, no sign she'd been pulled, just her tracks ending and then her, 20 feet later, set down in the timber. A heifer that size doesn't get carried by anything I'd put a name to, and the throat was wrong. I won't lay it all out, because there's no call to. But I'd skinned and butchered my whole life and the spread of it was wrong. Too wide. Wider than a lion's jaw. Wider than anything that ought to be working my country. And it had been done with a single hold. One bite. And that was all. A coyote worries a thing to death. A lion suffocates it and you can read the struggle in the grass. This was one hold and done. And she was a big, strong yearling. And there was no struggle in the grass at all. Whatever took her was strong enough that she never got the chance to fight. Then the wind came around and I got the smell. And I want to try to tell you about the smell. Because the smell is the thing that comes back to me first. Before the eyes. Before any of it. It was wet dog and rot. The rot of a thing dead 3 days. But heavier than that. With a thick animal musk laid over the top of it like the inside of a den that's never been aired. And it was strong. And it was fresh. And the heifer hadn't been dead 3 days. The heifer had been dead since the night before. The smell wasn't her. The smell was whatever had carried her, and it was strong enough, still, hours on, that the back of my neck drew up tight, and the skin pulled along my arms, and I stood up off my heels with the feeling, standing in that open grass in the middle of a clear morning, that I had better not have my back to the timber. I didn't reason it. My body did it before my head caught up. I got turned around so the trees were in front of me, and I backed off to the truck watching them. And I did not feel like a fool doing it, which a part of me noted, because feeling like a fool is the normal thing and I didn't feel it at all. I called fish, wildlife, and parks. You're supposed to, on a predator kill, and there's money in it if they confirm a wolf or a lion, and Lord knows the calf check could have used it. A warden came out the next day, a young fellow named Russ, and I walked him out to the heifer, and I watched a man who looks at dead stock for a living run out of road. He was good at his job. He measured the bite and he frowned at it. He looked at where she'd gone down and where she'd ended up, and he walked it twice. And the second time he walked it slower. He got down on his heels by the timber and he was quiet a while. "That's not a lion," he said. "Lion caches, lion covers, and a lion that'll take a yearling, I'd see the claws on her. Here, here." He touched his own shoulder. There's nothing on her shoulders. Something just took her by the throat and that was it. I asked him if it could be a wolf. I knew the answer, but I wanted to hear a man with a state truck say it. He sat back. "We don't really have wolves down here," he said. "They're a west of the divide animal. We'll get a disperser come through every few years. Some young male covering country looking for a mate. But a wolf this far east is a thing I'd be writing up and sending to Elena. And even then." He shook his head. A wolf doesn't carry a 500-pound heifer 20 feet. A wolf packs 80, 90 pounds. They tear in where it goes down and feed right there. This was carried. He said the word, like he didn't care for the taste of it. He took pictures. He pulled a tape and measured the bite again, like the number might come out different the second time, and it didn't. And I watched him decide not to write down what the number was telling him. On the report, he wrote, "Large predator, undetermined." He told me to call if I lost more, and to keep my dog in. And there was a minute where he stood by his truck with the door open and looked off at the timber and looked like he wanted to say something else, and then he got in and drove out, and he didn't say it. It's the look of a man who's decided that whatever he says, it'll cost him more than it helps, so he says nothing. I'd wear that same look myself before it was over. I went back out to that heifer myself after Russ left, alone. And I made myself read the ground like I'd read 100 kills, because I wanted to find the ordinary thing the warden had missed. I didn't find it. What I found was worse. Back behind where she'd gone down, in a patch of bare dirt under the pines, there was one track, just one, pressed deep into ground, my own boot, barely dented. It was longer than my hand laid flat, and it had toes, and ahead of the toes were the holes where claws had dug in, and it sat too long and too narrow to be a paw, and the back of it came down on a heel like nothing on 4 legs walks on. I had a tape in my pocket and I did not take it out. I'm not proud of that. I did not want a number, because a number would have made it a fact, and I wasn't ready to own the fact yet, so I scuffed it out with my boot instead, like a man hiding evidence, and the only one I was hiding it from was myself. I started moving cameras after that. I pulled the 2 off the water gaps and I put them where they'd see the timber edge along the west pasture, where I'd lost the heifer. Because if a lion or a wolf or a bear or anything else was working my cattle, I meant to put a face on it the same as I'd meant to put a face on the man who took my welder. I put a camera on the gate into the west pasture and one on a game trail coming down out of the breaks where the deer used to move before they quit, and I set them all to take a string of pictures when they tripped, 3 quick, and then a few seconds of video. Because video at night will show you a thing moving and a still won't. And for the better part of 2 weeks, I got nothing. That's the part I didn't understand at the time, and it's the part that ought to have told me the most. I was losing cattle and the cameras set to catch what was doing it caught nothing. Not the deer, because the deer were gone, but not the killer either. Whatever it was working my west pasture nights, and the cameras I'd hung to see it never tripped. A lion would have tripped them. A lion doesn't know what a camera is. This thing didn't trip them, and it took me too long to understand what that meant, which was that it knew where they were and it was going around them. The first picture I got of it I almost threw out. It was the camera on the gate, the 2nd week of October. I pulled the card on a Sunday and ran it on the laptop, flipping fast through 100 empty frames the way you do, and then there was one that wasn't empty, and I went past it and had to come back. 3:11 in the morning by the stamp. Just the gate and the dark behind it, and off at the edge of the frame, back in the grass at the limit of where the flash reached. 2 discs of light. Eye shine. The flash had caught a pair of eyes and thrown them back white, the way eye shine comes up white on those cameras at night. And I looked at it and thought, there's my lion, finally. And I felt better for about as long as it takes to read this sentence. Then I looked at where the eyes were. There was a fence post in the frame, one of my own steel posts, and I knew to the inch how tall that post stood, because I'd driven it, and the eyes were above the top of the post. They were better than 4 feet off the ground, and they were too far apart, and there was nothing under them the flash could find. No body, no shape, just the 2 white discs hanging back there in the dark above the height of my fence, pointed at the camera. A lion's eyes at that range would have been down low, a foot off the ground, close together. These were high and wide and level, and they were aimed straight at the lens. I sat at that table a long time with the one frame up on the screen. I told myself the post had heaved, or the camera was tilted, or it was a deer rearing up, or 2 coyotes' eyes lined up by accident. I'm a grown man, and I built 4 different lies sitting there, and not one of them would stand up against those 2 white discs hanging above my fence. And the next frame, 3 seconds later, was empty. Whatever it was had been there for the length of one flash and was gone, and a thing big enough to put its eyes that high off the ground does not cross out of a camera's view in 3 seconds without the camera catching it leave. Unless it knew exactly where the edge of the view was and stepped back out of it. I saw the eye shine myself for the first time a few nights after that. I'd gone out after supper to check on the cattle, just out to the yard fence with a flashlight, because they'd been bawling, restless, and I swept the light out across the home pasture and it caught 2 points of light, way out, where the pasture runs up to the timber, and I held the beam on them. They didn't run. A deer's eyes you catch in a light will swing away, and the deer's gone. These held. They held in my beam, steady, and they were high, higher than a deer's head, higher than my own, and they were level and wide-set and pale, a flat-washed yellow in the flashlight, and they did not blink, and they did not move, and they were looking back up the beam at me. I stood at my own fence with the light on them, and they let me hold the light on them. A wild animal caught in a light does not stand and let you study it. This stood and let me look, and the longer I looked, the more I had the feeling I'd got it backward, that it was out there in the dark at its ease, letting the man with the light believe he was the one doing the looking. I shut the flashlight off. I don't know why. I think I couldn't stand it looking back, and when I switched the light on again a few seconds later, the eyes were gone, and the pasture was empty, and the cattle had gone dead quiet. And I went back inside, and I did not tell Connie, because I didn't yet have the words to make it anything but a man scared of the dark, and I wasn't ready to be that man out loud. After that, the nights got loud and then they got quiet, and I learned that the quiet was the worse of the 2. I lost 2 more before the end of October, a calf and a dry cow, both the same, carried, one hold, and both closer to the house than the last. The heifer had been 2 miles out in the west pasture. The calf was in the home pasture, a half-mile from my back door. The dry cow was inside the first fence, close enough that I could see the spot from the kitchen window. It was working its way in. I didn't want to put it to myself like that, but a man who's watched coyotes learn a calving ground knows what it looks like when a thing is testing how close it can come. And this was that. Except no coyote ever made me feel the way this did. I started hearing it at night, not often. The first time I took it for a coyote and then I sat up in the bed, because it wasn't. It started off like a howl, off to the north, up toward the forest, a long rising note, and a coyote will yip and a wolf will hold a low note, but this one climbed, and kept climbing, up past where a howl ought to go, up into something with a tear in it, a sound with too much voice in it, like a howl trying to turn into a scream. Not quite a man and not quite a dog and not quite either. It ran down off the brakes and across the flat and came in through the bedroom window, and Connie woke up beside me and we both lay there not saying anything, and out in the yard Jip didn't bark. The dog that would bite a bull didn't make a sound. And after it there was a quiet that lay over the whole country, and I understood, lying there, that the quiet had been the thing all along. The empty cameras, the cattle in the open, the deer gone, the country holding its breath, It had been quiet for weeks, and I'd been too slow to hear it. I started carrying the rifle in the truck. I kept the 30-06 behind the seat and the little 22-250 I shoot coyotes with up in the rack. And I'll tell you a thing I didn't expect, which is that the rifle didn't help. I'd carried a gun my whole life, and a gun had always been an answer to whatever the question was. I'd put my hand on that 30-06 in the dark of the cab, and it was just a cold piece of steel, and the feeling I had wasn't the feeling of a man who's armed. I didn't know yet why, but even then, before I knew, my body knew. The gun was no comfort, and that was new, and it scared me worse than the kills did. Travis felt it too. He didn't say much, like I told you, but I'd catch him standing in the shop door looking north, and he started finding reasons not to be on the place after dark. He had a girl in town, and he'd always stayed over in the bunkhouse plenty, and now he was driving back to Broadus every night, 30 miles each way, rather than sleep out here, and he never said why, and I never made him. A man's allowed to know a thing without being able to say it. I hung a camera at the corrals the 1st of November. The cattle were coming in close at night by then, drifting up toward the buildings after dark like they wanted to be near the lights, near us. And they'd stand around the corrals and the calving shed in the dark, and I figured if the thing was following them in, the corrals were where I'd see it. I put a good camera on the corner post of the corral, faced out across the pen toward the timber side, set to video at night, and the third night, it tripped. I almost didn't watch it that morning. I'd had so many empty cards that I'd started running them half looking, coffee in one hand. And then the screen lit up out of the dark, and I set the coffee down, and I didn't pick it up again. It came up white first. That's how they show on those cameras at night, the eye shine, 2 white discs before you can see anything around them. And the discs came into the top of the frame from the left, high up, higher than the corral rails, and they stopped. And then the flash and the grain settled, and I could see what they sat in, and there isn't a good way to tell it, so I'll just tell you what was on my screen. It was standing at the corral fence on 2 legs. It was tall enough that its head came up over the top rail of the corral, and I knew that rail stood 5 feet because I'd built the corral, so the top of its head was better than 7 feet off the ground, and it stood the way a man stands, upright, square on 2 legs, with its weight set and its shoulders up. The head was long, a dog's head, a narrow muzzle and a heavy jaw, and the ears up high and pointed and turned forward. But it was set on a neck and shoulders that ran wrong. Too much shoulder, a deep chest, and arms, long arms, hanging down from those shoulders to clawed hands that came lower than any dog's front legs have business being, because they weren't front legs. It was covered in a coarse coat that came up grizzled and gray in the camera's light, gray going to silver along the back of the neck, and dark down the long bones of the legs. And the legs were the worst of it, because they bent the wrong way, hocked back like a dog's hind legs, but carrying all of it standing, the way no dog stands and no man stands and nothing I had ever seen stands. It stood there for 9 seconds. I counted them later, frame by frame. 9 seconds at my corral fence, in the dark, 40 feet from the room where my wife was sleeping, and then it turned its head, slow, and looked off toward the buildings, and it dropped, smooth, down onto all fours, and it was gone off the left of the frame, and a thing that size went out of view in under a second without touching a rail, and the next 10 minutes of video was just the corral and the dark, and my cows standing jammed in the far end of the pen, looking the way it had gone. I watched it 11 times. Connie came in partway through and stood behind my chair and watched it with me, and she put her hand on my shoulder and didn't take it off, and neither of us said anything for a long while, because there wasn't a word for it that would do anything but make it smaller, and we both knew that, and we sat there with the small black and white shape of it filling up the kitchen. And then I saw the thing I have not been able to put down since, the thing that turned this from a thing in the woods into something else. When it turned its head, those 9 seconds, before it dropped and ran, it didn't look at the cattle. The cattle were off to the right of the frame, bunched and afraid, 40 head of them, meat on the hoof, and it never once looked at them. It turned its head the other way. It looked at the house, past the camera, past the corral, at the dark kitchen window where the two of us would have been not 8 hours before. It stood at my corral with a pen full of beef beside it, and it looked at my house. And right at the end, right before it dropped, its head came back a few degrees, and for one frame, its face came around toward the corner post, toward the camera, and the white discs of its eyes pointed straight down the lens, and then it was gone. I told myself I imagined that last part. One frame, a trick of the angle. I told myself that for about a week. Then it started taking the cameras down, and I stopped telling myself anything at all. It started with the camera on the game trail, the one up in the brakes. I went to pull the card and the camera was facing the ground, strap still tight around the tree, housing not broke, lens not cracked, just turned, aimed down at the dirt at the foot of the tree, like a hand had reached up and tipped it. Wind doesn't do that. A bear that finds a camera tears it off the tree and chews on it. I've had it happen. You find the thing on the ground with tooth holes in it. This was tipped down, careful, left hanging there, pointed at nothing. I turned it back and I looked at the last card and there was nothing on it. Whatever turned it down had come up on it from behind, from the blind side of the tree where the camera couldn't see, and tipped it without ever passing in front of the lens. The next week, it was the West Pasture Gate camera, gone. The strap pulled, the buckle popped, and the camera nowhere. And I crawled around in that grass for an hour and never found it, and I never have. The one on the calving shed I came out to find facing the wall, swung on its mount to stare at the boards from 6 inches away. The one on the lane it left alone. The cell camera on the lane, the one that texts a picture, it never touched, and I understood why when I'd thought about it long enough. And the understanding was the worst yet. It left the cameras that faced the road and the buildings, the ones aimed where I'd be looking out from. It took down the ones that faced the timber, the ones aimed at where it came from. It was taking down the cameras that watched its country and leaving up the cameras that watched mine. It knew which was which. It knew what every one of those cameras could see, and it had gone around and shut the eyes that pointed its way and left the eyes that pointed at me. And a man does not want to know a thing in the dark is doing math about which of his cameras to blind. I've had years to talk myself out of this part, sitting right here, and I can't do it. A lion doesn't do this, and a wolf doesn't, and a bear that finds a camera just tears it off the tree and leaves tooth holes in it. I have run that 1,000 ways. There is no way to run it that doesn't end with the thing knowing exactly what a camera is and exactly where each one of mine was. I drove to Broadus, and I bought every trail camera the hardware had, 4 of them. And a man at the counter I'd known 30 years asked me what I was after with all those cameras. And I told him coyotes, and he gave me a look, because nobody buys 4 cameras for coyotes, but he didn't push it. I took them home and I set them in a careful spread. No 2 of them where the last ones had been. Some up high in the trees pointed down, some down low pointed up. One inside the calving shed pointed out the door, figuring I'd cover every line it could come in on and leave it nowhere to step that an eye couldn't find. It went around all 4. Not one of them so much as tripped on it, and meanwhile the cell camera on the lane caught my own self walking out to set them, and caught the cattle, and caught a coyote trotting through one night plain as day, so I knew the cameras worked. They worked on everything but the one thing I'd bought them for. It came in those nights. I'd find the cattle moved and bunched in the morning, and once I found where it had stood in soft ground by the shed, and it had come and gone through a spread of 6 cameras and tripped not one of them, and there is only one accounting for that. It saw them. It saw every one of them in the dark, and it walked the lines between what they could catch like a man stepping over tripwires he'd been handed a map of, and I stood in my yard in the cold with 6 dead cameras and understood that I could not buy enough of them, that there was no number of eyes I could hang that it would not simply count and step around, and that it had known what I was doing from the first card I ever pulled. So I did a foolish thing. I decided to outsmart it. I had one more camera, a little one, and I hid it. I waited until the middle of the day, when I had never once gotten it on a camera in daylight, and I went out to the yard fence on foot and I strapped that little camera low to a cedar post, down at knee height, tucked back under the bottom wire where the dead grass came up around it, faced back toward the house. I didn't drive a post or dig or do anything it might read later as new. I put it where a man crawling the fence line in the dark would never find it, low and small and pointed the wrong way, at my own back door, because if it was coming up to look at my house, I wanted to see it do it. And I figured the one place it wouldn't think to look for an eye was down low, behind it, aimed at me. That's the camera I opened this whole thing with. That's the card I ran the next morning with my coffee going cold. It came up the lane side, out of the borrow pit along the road, on two legs, and crossed to the fence, and I had it, finally, full and clear, and close, 20 feet from the lens, the grizzled gray of it and the long arms and the hocked back legs and the head swinging low and side to side as it came. And it stopped at the fence, right at the wire, and it raised its head and looked at the house, at the dark windows, the same as it had looked from the corral, taking in the building the way you take in a thing you've been studying a while. And I sat there at the table thinking, I've got you. I finally hid one where you'd never. And then, on the screen, it lowered its head, and it turned. And it looked down and back, under the bottom wire, at knee height, into the dead grass, straight into that little hidden lens, from 20 feet, in the dark. And it held there, looking into the camera I had hidden that afternoon where nothing should have known to look, and the white discs of its eyes filled up the middle of my screen, and it did not move, and it did not blink, for 4 seconds, and then it turned and went back the way it had come. I don't know how it knew the camera was there. I've never known. It hadn't been there a day. It was the size of a pack of cigarettes, and it was tucked under a wire in dead grass facing the wrong way, and the thing came up the fence in the dark, and looked at the house, and then looked down and back, and put its eyes on a lens it had no way of knowing existed. I have told myself it smelled it, that I'd left scent on it, that it followed my track to the post. Maybe. I've told myself that one the most. But it didn't sniff the post. It didn't nose around. It came up, looked at the house, then dropped its head and turned and looked dead into the one eye I'd hidden, first try, like it had watched me hang it from somewhere out in the dark that afternoon, and then it left. Connie watched that one over my shoulder too. When it looked into the lens, she made a sound I'd never heard her make, and she got up and checked the doors, both of them, and the windows, and she came back and sat down and said, real quiet, Wade, it knows where we are. And I didn't have anything to tell her, because she was right, and we'd both just watched it be right. She saw it herself 2 nights later, and that's when it quit being only my story, because a man can half decide he imagined a thing as long as he's the only one it ever happened to. She'd gone out at dusk to bring Jip in, just to the edge of the yard light, calling the dog, and the dog wouldn't come out from under the porch, and Connie stood there in the last of the light with the cold coming down, and looked out past the yard fence toward the field, and it was standing there, at the field line, where the mowed yard runs into the pasture grass, maybe 60 yards out, in the gray light, upright, still, its head turned toward her. She said it was the stillness that got her. Not that it came at her, that it didn't move at all, that it stood there at the edge of the light, tall and gray and patient, and watched her, and let her see it watching, and made no move to come, and no move to go. She said she couldn't make her feet work for a second, and then she got hold of herself and walked backward to the door, not running, watching it, and it watched her the whole way, and never took a step, and when she got inside and shut the door and looked back out the window, it was gone. Just gone. No movement at the field line, nothing crossing the open. It had been there, and then the light was a little worse, and it wasn't. That was the night Connie stopped sleeping. I'd find her up at 3 sitting in the dark front room with the lights off, looking out at the yard, because she said she'd rather see it coming than lie there waiting for it. We were both 50-some years old, and we were sitting up in shifts in our own house like there was a war on, and the whole time those cows were out in the grass, the whole year of work, and shipping coming, and a thing in the dark that had looked the both of us in the eye and knew which window was the bedroom. Those were bad weeks, and the worst of it wasn't the nights. It was the days. At night, at least, the thing was real and out there, and you could point at the dark and say it's there. In the daytime, the country looked like it always had, clean and broad and ordinary, and you'd start to feel foolish, start to think you'd built the whole thing up out of dead cows and a bad video, and then you'd catch Connie standing at the sink, not washing anything, just looking out the window at the field line in the middle of a sunny afternoon, and you'd know she was doing the same arithmetic you were, and it would all come back. I'd watch her at the stove and think about how I'd brought her out to this country 30-some years ago and promised her it was a good place, a safe place, a place to raise a life, and how I had no idea anymore if that had ever been true, or if the thing had just been up in the timber all those years, biding, and we'd been lucky, and the luck had run out. A man doesn't say that to his wife. I never said it. But I thought it every day that fall, standing in my own kitchen with my coffee, watching the timber line out the window like it owed me an answer. I went to see Wendell Stewart about it, finally, because if anybody knew, it'd be him. Wendell ran the outfit that joined mine on the north, up against the forest, and his people had been on that ground since before Montana was a state. He was past 80 and still horseback most days, and he'd known my granddad, and he'd known this country longer and closer than any living man. I didn't go in and sit at his table and lay it out like a confession. I caught him out where he was fixing a stretch of fence the elk had walked down, and I got off and helped him stretch wire, and we worked a while, and then I told him, with my hands busy on the wire so I didn't have to look at him, that I'd been losing stock to something I couldn't account for, and that I'd seen it, and that it was tall, and it walked on 2 legs, and it had taken down my cameras, and I told him about the head and the gray coat and the way it looked at the house. He didn't laugh, and he didn't look surprised, and he kept splicing wire while I talked. And when I was done, he was quiet a while, working, and then he said, "Your granddad lost stock to it in '38. I hadn't known that. He told me my granddad had lost cows the winter of '38, in the breaks, killed the same way, carried, and that he'd seen something up against the timber that he would talk about exactly once. To Wendell's own father, the 2 of them young men then, and never again. Granddad never told me. He'd run that place 40 more years and put me on a horse on it and never once said a word, and I understood that. Standing there, better than I wanted to. You don't hand that to your grandson. You keep it." Wendell said. It came and went. Said there'd be years, a lot of years, where the country was just the country. And then there'd be a fall, where the deer would clear out, and the dogs would quit, and the stock would bunch, and the old people had a word for that, the year it came down, and the only thing to do was pull your stock in close, keep your lights on, and leave it the part of the country it wanted. The high broke ground, and the deep timber up in the forest, and not go up in there after it, not for stock, not for anything. He said the homestead families that pulled out of these breaks 100 years ago, the ones whose cellar holes you still find back in the draws, didn't all leave for the drought and the dust. Some of them left for this. They just didn't put that part on the paper they filed at the land office. He told me one more thing, and he told it careful. He said the Cheyenne had known about it a long time before any white man ever ran a cow up these draws, that it was in their country and their understanding long before it was in ours, and that they'd had the right of it, which was to leave it alone and give it room, and that the worst thing the homesteaders ever did was crowd a thing that had been here first. He didn't say more than that, and I didn't ask, because it wasn't mine to ask, and I could tell he felt the same. I asked him the only thing I really wanted to know. I asked him if it would come to the house. Wendell set down his pliers and looked at me for the first time since I'd started talking. "It already has," he said. "You told me it has. It's been up to your windows, so you already know it'll come. The question you're asking is whether it'll come in." He looked off toward the forest, toward the dark line of it up north. "I never knew it to come through a door," he said. "I've known it to take stock, and I've known it to walk a man home, and I've known it to stand outside a wall all night and let a family lie there and listen to it. But I never knew it to come through a door. I think it could. I think it doesn't the same way you don't bother to kick over an anthill you walk past every day. It's not that you couldn't. It's that there's no reason, and it's beneath you." Then he said, "Pull your stock in. Get through the winter. Come spring it might be gone, and you'll wonder if you dreamed the whole thing, and that's the best you can hope for. So hope for it. I want to tell you about the night with the rifle, because it's the night I understood why the gun was no comfort, and I've never told it right to anybody, because there's no way to tell it that doesn't make me sound like a coward, and maybe I was, but I'll tell it anyway. It came to the corrals again the second week of November, late, and this time I was awake and sitting in the dark front room the way Connie had taught me, with the 30-06 across my knees, and I heard the cattle stir and move in the dark out by the pens. And I got up and I went out the back, quiet, in my sock feet with my boots in one hand and the rifle in the other, and I got the boots on against the side of the house, and I came around the corner of the shop with the rifle up, and there it was. It was at the corral fence, 60 feet off, standing, the gray of it just catching what little light came off the yard pole, and it had its back half turned, working at something along the rails, and I had it. I want you to understand I had it. I went down on a knee against the corner of the shop and I put the scope on it, and I found the dark mass of its shoulder in the glass, and my finger was on the trigger and the safety was off, and at 60 feet, braced, I do not miss. I have killed running coyotes at 3 times that. It was the easiest shot I will ever be offered in my life and the most important, and I could not make my finger close. It wasn't nerves. That's the part I can't make people understand. My hands were steady. The crosshair sat on its shoulder and did not waver. It was something else, something my body had figured out a long time before my head would say it out loud, which was that if I pulled that trigger and it did not go down, I was going to die. And worse than that, Connie was going to die, and that the only thing keeping the two of us alive in that minute was that the thing had not yet decided we were worth the trouble, and that a bullet that didn't kill it would make that decision for it. I had no faith the bullet would kill it, none. I'd watched it carry off 500-pound stock with one bite and take down my cameras and look into a hidden lens in the dark, and the idea that 180 grains of lead was going to end, that was a child's idea, and I knew it kneeling there with the shot of my life sitting in the glass, and then it turned its head and looked at the scope. I don't know how else to say it. It was 60 feet off with its back half turned, and it knew I was there. It had known the whole time, and it turned its long head around over its shoulder, slow, and it looked back, and it found me in the dark against the corner of the shop, and it put its eyes on the front of my scope, and I was looking through the glass at it, looking through the glass at me, and the pale of its eyes came up in the scope like 2 coins held to a poor light, and it knew what the scope was. It knew what I was holding and what I was doing with it, and it looked into the front of it the way it had looked into the lens of my camera, and it was not afraid, and it did not move, and it let me kneel there with my finger on the trigger and the shot of my life lined up. And it waited to see what I'd do. I understood that it was letting me decide, and that whichever I decided, it had already decided what came after, and that mine was the smaller decision. I took my finger off the trigger. I put the safety on. I lowered the rifle. I don't know to this day if that was the bravest or the most cowardly thing I ever did, and I've quit trying to know. The thing held my eye another moment, and then it turned, easy, like a man who's seen what he came to see, and dropped to all fours and went off into the dark toward the timber, unhurried, and left me kneeling against my own shop in the cold with a rifle that had never once felt like less in my hands. That was when I understood the gun. The gun was no comfort, because the gun was a lie. It let me believe I had a say. I didn't have a say. I'd never had a say. The only reason I was alive was that the thing had not yet wanted me dead, and no rifle was going to change that. And the night I knelt there and didn't shoot was the night I quit pretending otherwise. Travis quit the week after Thanksgiving. He didn't make a thing of it. He came in one morning and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said he'd taken on at a place down by Miles City, more money, closer to his girl, and we both knew it was none of those things, and I shook his hand and paid him through the month and didn't make him say it. He'd seen the corral video. He'd heard it on the breaks at night, same as me. He had his whole life out ahead of him and no cows of his own to lose, and he was right to go, and I told him so, and he looked grateful and ashamed at the same time, and he left. and then it was just Connie and me and 400 cattle and the winter coming on. I called Russ at Fish and Wildlife one more time after the third camera went missing, and I could hear it in his voice that the file was closed as far as the state was concerned. Large predator, undetermined. He was kind about it. He said without a carcass that showed a confirmable species, there was nothing to compensate and nothing to act on, and that he'd logged everything I'd told him, and there was a pause on the line. And then he said, off the record, quiet, that I wasn't the only call he'd taken out of those breaks over the years, and that he'd learned to write down what he could prove and keep the rest to himself, and he wished me luck. That was the last I talked to the state about it. They were never going to come stand in my yard at night, and I didn't blame them, and I was on my own with it, and the snow was starting to come. The storm came the second week of December, and it was the kind that kills people who aren't careful, and it nearly handed me to the thing on a plate. It started as wind, and then the snow came in on the wind sideways, a ground blizzard, the air full of it, the temperature falling all afternoon until the radio out of Miles City said the wind chill would be 40 below by midnight. I'd brought the cattle in as close as I could get them, up against the windbreak and the corrals and the lee of the calving shed. 400 head crowded into the shelter of the buildings, because in a storm like that they'll drift with the wind and pile up against a fence, and the back ones will smother the front ones, and you can lose 100 head against one fence in one night. So I wanted them in tight where the buildings would break the wind, and I got them there before dark, and then the power went out. It goes out in a storm like that. A line comes down somewhere, or the wind takes a pole, and you're dark, and we've got a generator for it, but the generator's in the shop, and I wasn't walking out to the shop in a 40 below whiteout for lights. So we lit the lamps and the wood stove, and we sat in the dark house and listened to the wind try to take the roof, and the cell camera on the lane went dead with the power, and every eye I had on that place went dark at once, and out in the howling dark 400 cattle stood crowded against my buildings, and I sat in the lamplight and knew, the way you know a thing in your gut, that this was the night. It had taken my cameras one at a time, and now the storm had taken the last of them, and it was out there in the white dark, and there was nothing left to see it coming. We sat there a long time in the lamplight, not talking, the wind shoving at the house, and I had the rifle across my knees, and Connie had her hands wrapped around a coffee gone cold, and there is a particular kind of waiting that wears a hole in you, the waiting for a thing you know is coming and cannot do one thing to stop. Every gust that hit the wall, I thought that's it. Every groan of the house in the cold, I thought it's at the door. I would rather have been out in it. That's a true thing I learned that night. I would rather have been moving in the storm than sitting still in the warm, waiting for the storm to bring it to me. Around 10, the cattle blew up. You know the sound of cattle when they panic, the bawling and the pound of it. 400 head hitting a fence at once, and it came up out of the storm off the south side of the corrals, the whole herd stampeding all at once in the dark, and I was up and into my coat and my boots before I'd thought about it. Because if they went through the south fence, they'd drift out into the open in that storm and die. Every one of them, the whole year, and a man doesn't sit in a warm house and let that happen no matter what's out there. Connie grabbed my arm. I can still feel her hand on my arm. She said, "Don't." She said, "Let them go." She said, "It's out there." And I knew it was out there. That was the point. It was out there in the herd. That was why they were running. But I had 400 head going through a fence, and I went out the door into the storm with the lantern and the 30-06. And that was the closest I ever came to dying. And it had nothing to do with the cold. I couldn't see 10 feet. The lantern lit up a wall of blowing snow and nothing past it, and the wind took the breath out of my mouth, and I went toward the sound of the cattle along the corral rails with one hand on the rails to keep my line, and the bawling and the thunder of them was all around me in the white. And I came around the south corner of the corral into the teeth of it, and I walked nearly into the thing. It was standing in the open at the corner of the corral, in the storm, and the cattle were pouring past it in the dark on both sides, breaking around it like water around a rock, and it was not chasing them. It was just standing there in the whiteout letting them run. And I came around the corner with my lantern, and there it was, 8 feet from me, towering up over me into the blowing snow, and the lantern light went up it, the gray coat packed with snow, the deep chest, the long arms, the head coming down toward me, and the smell of it hit me even in that wind, the wet dog and the rot and the den musk of it, right in my face, and I looked up, and its eyes caught the lantern and threw it back pale, 2 coins of dirty light a foot above my own, and we stood there in the storm, the 2 of us, close enough that I could have reached out and put my hand on its chest. I had the rifle in my right hand and the lantern in my left, and I could not have brought the rifle up in time, and we both knew it. It looked down at me. The cattle ran past us in the dark, and the wind screamed, and it looked down at me from a foot over my head, close enough that I felt the heat come off it, close enough that I could see the snow melting on the coarse hair of its face, and it did not move, and I did not move. And it looked at me the way it had looked at the camera and the scope, like it was reading something off me, like it was deciding, and I stood there in the snow and waited to find out what it had decided, and there was nothing in my hands or my head that could change the answer. And it stepped back. It lifted its head off me, and it took 1 step back into the storm, and the white closed over it a little, and it stood there 1 more second at the edge of the lantern light, just the shape of it now, the head and the shoulders going gray in the blowing snow, and then it turned, and it was gone, swallowed up in the white, and the cattle were still running. And I was standing alone at the corner of my corral in a 40 below whiteout, with a lantern and a rifle, and my whole body shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. I got the cattle stopped. It took the better part of an hour, and it was cold, ugly work and mostly luck. They'd hit the south fence and turned along it instead of going through it, by the grace of God. And I got around the lead of them in the dark and turned them back into the lee of the buildings, the danger past, the thing gone out of the herd. And they bunched up tight against the windbreak and stood. And I stood with them a minute, making sure. And then I went back to the house with 1 hand on the rails the whole way, and Connie had the door open and the lamp up before I got there, and she got me inside and got the door shut and bolted, for whatever a bolt was worth, and she held on to me and I held on to her, and we didn't either of us say a word, and the wind went on screaming all night. And we sat up till light with the lamps lit and the rifle across my knees, and it didn't come again. In the morning, the storm had blown itself out, and the world was white and still and hard with cold. The sky that deep, clean blue it gets after a ground blizzard. The snow drifted up over the bottom wire of the fences and squeaking under your boots at 20 below. I went out to see to the cattle, and they were all there, all of them, drifted up against the windbreak and humped against the cold, but alive. Every head, and I stood and counted them twice and felt something let go in my chest that had been clenched up for 3 months. And then I walked back toward the house, and I saw the tracks. They came up out of the south, out of the storm's direction, across the fresh snow of the yard. 1 line of them, 2-legged, each one longer than my boot by half, the snow pushed up at the heel where the weight had driven in. They came across the yard, past the corral, straight to the house. They came up to the kitchen window, the window we'd sat behind all night with the lamp lit and the rifle across my knees. And at the window they stopped, and the snow was packed down there where it had stood and looked in at the 2 of us through the glass while the storm covered the sound of it, 10 feet from where we sat, all night maybe, or part of it, and we never knew. And then the tracks turned and went back across the yard the way they'd come. The same even stride going as coming, out into the south pasture and gone over the drift line where I lost them in the country it had come out of. It had been at the window. While we sat up keeping watch with the lights on, it had walked up through the storm we thought was hiding us and stood at the glass and looked in at us, close enough to touch through the wall, and it had looked its fill, and it had turned around and walked away, and left us sitting there thinking we'd kept it off with a lamp and a bolt. We hadn't kept it off anything. It had come right up to us in the 1 window of dark it knew we couldn't see through, and it had stood and looked, and then it had decided, the same as it decided at the corral and in the storm, that it was done, and it had gone. That was the last of it. I don't know why. Wendell said maybe come spring it'd be gone, and I'd wonder if I dreamed it, and that's near enough how it went. except I had the card and I had the tracks and I had Connie, who'd looked it in the eye same as me. So I never got to wonder if I dreamed it. It just stopped. The deer came back to the water cameras in March. A few at first and then all of them. Every night. So many you quit looking, and the morning I flipped through a card and saw deer on it again. I sat down at the table and put my face in my hands, because that was how I knew the country had its breath back. The thing had gone back up into the high broke ground and the deep timber of the forest, into the part of the country Wendell said to leave it, and it left us the rest. And we have not seen it or heard it or lost a head to it since. We sold the cattle that fall, all of them. We shipped the calves in October like always, and then we sold the cows too, the whole herd, base and all, and I leased the grass to a younger outfit that runs yearlings on it in the summer and pulls them off before the snow, and we bought a little place in town, in Broadus, on a street with lights and neighbors and a dog or two barking of an evening. And we moved off the ranch my granddad put together in the 30s, the ground I'd figured to die on. People in town figured we'd got old and tired, and we let them figure it. Connie couldn't live out there anymore. She tried to tell me she could, and she couldn't, and the truth is, neither could I. And we both knew it was her not sleeping that was the real reason, and we both let it be the cattle prices instead. Because that's a thing you can say to people. I think about the place every day. 5 generations of us on that ground, my granddad's sweat in it and my dad's and mine, and I handed it to a stranger's yearlings and a summer lease and walked away at 58 with most of my life still in front of me, and I let the whole county think it was cattle prices and old age. It isn't just the ranch. It's that the thing took the ranch from me without ever laying a claw on me, took it as easy as it took my cameras, just by standing at my window one night and letting me understand that the ground was its ground when it wanted to be, and only mine when it allowed, and that I'd been living all those years on a lease I never knew I held, from a landlord I never knew was there. Once you know that about a place, you can't unknow it, and you can't sleep in it, and so you leave. And you let folks think whatever's easiest, and you carry the real reason around in you like a stone. I still go out there. You can't lease ground and not look at it, and I drive out and check fence and check water, and look at the yearlings, and the country in the daylight is the same beautiful broke Pine Ridge country it always was, and most days I forget, but I'm off that place before the sun's down. Every time. I've never spent another night out there, and I never will. And when I'm driving out the county road in the long light of an evening and I get done before dark and turn the truck for town, there's a part of me that eases up only when the lights of Broadus come into sight, and I don't fight that part anymore. I've learned to listen to it. It kept me alive once. The card's in a drawer in the kitchen. I've never put it anywhere a person could find it. I never showed it to Russ or to anybody at the state, and I never put it up on the internet, and I never will, because I've seen what happens to the few people who do, and it isn't belief they get back. It's the other thing, and I've had all of the other thing I can stand. So you won't find it out there. You'll have to take my word, or not. And I've made my peace with which way most people go. But I'll tell you the one thing I know now that I didn't know that fall, and you can keep it or not. It's not the kill you have to fear with a thing like that. It carried off my stock. But the kills were never the worst of it. The worst of it was that it could have had me, at the corral and in the storm and at that window in the dark. It could have had Connie. It could have had any of us any night it chose, and it didn't, and it made sure I knew it. It let me see it decide. That's the part that doesn't leave you. A thing that hunts you and kills you, that's an animal, and you can live with an animal. A thing that hunts you and could kill you and looks you in the eye and lets you live, that owns a piece of you after. And it knows it does, and that's the reason it lets you go. So if you run stock, or hunt, or just live out at the end of some road where the timber comes down close, and there comes a fall when the deer go off your cameras, and your dog won't leave the porch, and your cattle won't get near the trees after dark, and the whole country goes quiet around you the way it goes quiet before a hard snow, don't go up in the timber to see what's wrong. Pull your stock in close. Keep your lights on. Leave it the high ground and the deep dark it wants, and stay out of it, and get through your winter. And if you ever hang a camera to catch it, and you go to pull the card some morning, and the thing on it turns its head and looks straight down your lens out of the dark, like it knew right where you put it, like it's looking back at you through the glass and into your kitchen, and right at you where you sit. You shut the laptop, you take the card out, and you put it in a drawer, and you don't ever let it know how close it came to making you look back.